What things do and do not have GST? This can be really confusing. So first of all, I guess we want to figure it out in the real world. So in the real world, like you as a consumer, some of the things that you pay for and your parents pay for will have GST, some won't. The easiest way is just to go, every good and every service does have GST, except for if you go to the tax office website. They do say there are some things that are GST free, and this is not even the full list, this is just some of it, but it says most basic food. What does that even mean? Does it mean, is a Snickers bar basic food? Is an apple basic food? Well, basically, it sort of means like any food that's sort of natural, like fruit and vegetables, water, that sort of stuff. But other things like soft drinks and chocolates and McDonald's, yeah, that would have GST. Some education courses, so your school fees, your doctor's fees, the medicines you pay, but I mean, you look at it like precious metals, farmland. Probably the only one that would impact us really is the sale of the business. If I sold the business as a going concern. But the point is, we actually don't need to know all that. Like, that's not really, we don't sort of go by reality in our course here. We keep it reasonably simple. So how will you know which items do and don't have GST? Well, the first way is to read the question. Pretty much every question will simply just tell you whether an item has 10% GST. It will say this item did have GST, or it will say plus GST, or it will say an amount that says including GST, that sort of thing. However, there will be occasionally some items or some questions which require you to know whether an item has 10% GST. What do you do then? Well, we're going to take a note here. So we're going to go to our notes and we're going to say in our course, these things are the things that do have GST, and it's a pretty comprehensive list. So let's divide them into two groups. Let's say out of the money we receive and the revenues we make, which can often be the same thing, let's do them here. And over here, the things we pay or the expenses we incur, our liabilities, let's put them there. So the receipts and revenues that will always have GST in our course will always be our cash sales, our credit sales, and our sales returns from customers. We haven't even dealt with what a sales return is. So these lists are going to have things that we haven't even dealt with yet, okay? So we're just going to write down our note and keep it for later and just say, yeah, sales returns will have GST. What about on the other side? Well, all the expenses we pay will always have GST, except for those on the next slide. When we purchase inventory, that will always have GST. When we purchase a non-current asset like a computer or some fixtures or a building or a car, we'll say that will have GST. And also purchase returns to suppliers. Again, we don't even know what that is. We're just going to make a list now and come back to it later in the year. So these are the things that do have GST, and together all of that, it's not a real big list, but like it's only, 7 items, but that will be like 95% of the things that we do. However, there will be some things that don't have GST, and this list is going to be much longer. It's going to be very confusing looking at it right now and going, how am I meant to remember all this? But you just will. As we go through the course, you'll just see and things and go, I know that does have GST, that doesn't. But what we're going to do now is just take a note, and to try and help us remember, we're going to kind of learn them in inverse. What do we mean? Well, let's start over here. With the receipts and revenues that we have, these are the things that don't have GST, and then we'll sort of match them up and go, well, the opposite of it would be in here, the payments, the expenses, and liabilities. What are we talking about? Let's start here. Receipts and revenues. So when I get a receipt from an account receivable, someone that owes me money, that will not have GST on it. Likewise, when I pay an account payable because I owe them money for buying inventory, that won't have GST. Now that can be really confusing to understand why. We're going to deal with that in separate videos later in the course. But you can see they're kind of opposites of each other. When I get a receipt from an account receivable, no GST. And the opposite of that, when I pay an account payable, no GST. All right, what else? Capital contributions do not have GST. And the opposite of those are drawings. They don't have GST either. And what about when we receive a loan from the bank? There's no GST on loans. Likewise, there's no GST on loan repayments, which makes sense. All right, let's do our next group of sort of opposites. So over here, when I earn interest, that's called interest revenue or good interest, no GST, and likewise, no interest on the bad, no GST on the bad interest expense. Discount revenue and discount expense, we don't even know what those are yet. We're going to get to those later in the course, but for now, we're just going to say both of those are GST free. Likewise, we haven't dealt with any of this stuff yet. Inventory gain, inventory loss, inventory write-down, we'll get to that, but they will be GST free. And profit on disposal or a loss on disposal of a non-current asset, that's ages away. That's in Unit 4, but we'll just write that down now and say no GST. What about these, just in this last category now, we just got some odds and ends that are just kind of, we're just going to have to remember. So the proceeds from disposing of a non-current asset, again, we don't know what that is. Commission revenue doesn't really popped up. Over here is the important one. This is one we're going to have a lot of transactions to do with, cost of sales. Whenever there is a cost of sale, there is no GST. And again, I will explain that in a separate video why. Also, in terms of our expenses, the only really big expense that will probably be in every question that doesn't have GST is wages. We've also got a couple of randoms, bad and doubtful debts and depreciation, but again, they're way away in Unit 4. So there's a lot to remember there. So the main thing now is just to remember, we're just going to write down a list here and take a note of what does and doesn't have GST. And we know 95% of the transactions that we do, we already know. There's just all these little things that we've got to add in. And as we add them in, we'll just learn that whether they do or they don't have GST.